There are many ways to grow content on a website. The first path to growing content is using a single language and then expand on that language for quite a while and distribute that content in English, for example, or in the language of your customer base. That allows you to essentially serve part of the market. And another way to grow is, of course, to expand into multiple languages. Nowadays, most of the economies and most of the products are global. And what may be of interest to someone in America could be of interest to someone in Europe, someone who, for example, does not speak English, or it could be of interest to people in Latin America or in Asia, and vice versa. So today, running multilingual websites is becoming more and more the norm. So today we're going to talk about a few considerations that happen at the technical level when you think about growing a website by adding a different language and translating your content into another language. We'll assume that we start with a base website, that you already have one install, and that what you're doing at that point is you're asking yourself, what do I do from the time I have this one install to create content of a similar article, of a given article in a different language? So let's go through this list for today. The first consideration really is to think about how you're going to produce that new content. If your content is already written, there are plenty of services, of web services, that will translate, that will auto-translate the content for you. That will give a non-human touch. It will give, as of today, at least an imperfect translation, something you could start from, but in most cases you will have to reread that content. You'll have to proofread it and fix both the errors of vocabulary, of style. This is not perfect as of right now. One thing that is emerging is that for some types of content, like press releases, financial reports, it's more and more the case that some software actually writes it because it can take the data of, for example, an annual report, a balance sheet, an income statement, and take those numbers and put them with words around it. And those words are pretty simple and pretty standard. For example, last year, sales grew by 27%. So if you take 27% as a calculation, the machine understands where that sits in the database. It'll basically write a financial report with words around it and just replace the values by doing database queries. And that will become the case more and more as we go into the century. Those technologies are going to become more mature, and robots and automation is going to be able to write the content with more and more quality and more of a human touch. In spite of that, today and for the foreseeable future, you'll need people. So when you start translating, you'll realize that people, for example, will leave comments on your posts. You'll need to have someone who understands the comment and can respond to the comment in that particular language. That's the first reason. And then, of course, for the proofreading, today we need humans for that. As you go through now the actual ways to post and to structure your site, if we take the example of WordPress, WordPress has two implementations. The base implementation is a single site. And if you have a second website, then you have two single sites. Alternatively, WordPress allows you to set up a multi-site implementation. When you set up a multi-site implementation, it means that the two sites will share the WordPress files and they will share the WordPress database. So you'll have one set of files for WordPress and one database, and each of those sites will have its piece carved out inside that file system and then inside that single database. There are reasons why you might want to run single sites. One of them is that you want to customize the files, you want to customize the plugins, you want to keep the databases separate, and you don't have a whole lot of sites. That allows you to run single sites, and you'll have one site in English, one site in Chinese, one site in Portuguese, one site in German, etc. If you have 100 websites, of course, that doesn't scale. At some point, nobody can really manage hundreds of websites or thousands of websites if it means having hundreds of WordPress sets of files, hundreds of databases. Something is always going to happen to one of these hundreds or thousands of databases. So at some point, if you truly have a massive amount of websites, you will have to go multi-site. Once you've decided this, you can go into the DNS discussion, which is the DNS discussion says, do you want to structure your site as a set of subdomains? For example, site1.yourdomain.com, site2.yourdomain.com. These are subdomains. Or you want to structure that in folders, yourdomain.com/site1/site2. And these are kind of the two alternatives that you have when you do these multiple languages. The advantage of the subdomain is that you can play with DNS. You can change the DNS settings for each subdomain. You can run site1 on its own server and site2 also on its own server, and you can direct the traffic from the DNS fairly easily into those subdomains. When you have folders, it's much more difficult, if not impossible. These folders will have to share the same DNS settings if that's the path that you want to take. As we go back to contents, even if you have translators around you, as the site owner, you will have to do some writing of titles, of metadata, in the particular languages that you use. And many of these languages use keyboards that have different layouts. Many of these languages have accents, and if these accents are not easily accessible on your keyboard, it'll be harder. So there are many paths to getting a multilingual keyboard. There's a separate post on that if you want to do a search. We'll talk about the multilingual keyboard, but that's not the main topic of discussion. It's just an element of that discussion. Finally, we talk about plugins and SEO. If you decide to run different languages, you will have to link each post, for example, the English version and the Chinese version. You'll have to link these two posts so that you can refer them in your website as the same content. Some plugins make that fairly easy because they automate the linking and the storing and the structuring of the URL. The downside of using a plugin is that you become dependent on that plugin. The plugin may change the way that the data is structured in your database. And if one day that plugin goes away, if you choose a different plugin, your content may be stored in the database in some fairly proprietary formats, in some fairly unique format by that plugin. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, how likely is this to happen? How difficult is it to convert the content? And there's always a switching cost, but the question really is how hard is it? And that, of course, directs you to the overall SEO strategy. And in the post associated with this video, we provide some links, and particularly the way that Google and search engines want you to think about SEO for multiple languages, how you declare the language of a particular web page from the top so that the search engines understand, of course, by reading the content and seeing what language that is, but at the metadata level, how it can make that decision quickly. All right, guys, that's all for today. Take care. Cheers.